Hi, this is Dave Smith, Senior Editor for TennisOne.com and Dunlop Racket Sports Master Professional. I'd like to welcome you to this DVD on tuning up your serve. Whether you're a club player, a tennis teaching professional, a beginner, or a tournament player looking to raise your game or improve that serve, giving you that edge, this DVD is certainly for you. It's both comprehensive and specific. It will identify problems in your game or elements of your serve which can be improved starting today. Within this DVD, you're going to find very specific as well as very comprehensive tools in which you can improve your serve. Whether you are trying to elevate your serve as a tournament player or a beginner who wants to find a foundation that will allow you to generate and execute a terrific serve that will be both effective, consistent, and give you the confidence to take your game to a higher level. Well, let's face it, the serve itself, and specifically the second serve, can be the defining point within a player's overall perception of ability. If you're looking for how to hit a kick serve, a slice serve, a hybrid serve, a flat serve, this DVD is going to cover every element, not only of those serves, but of the common problems that players face when trying to execute a more effective serve. So if you're a player that has difficulty generating speed, spin, directional control, diversity, all the things that contribute to a great serve, this is what this DVD is and is designed for you to help you reach that high level as it applies to the serve. This DVD is also designed for the teaching pro. We have you in mind as well because, let's face it, as a teaching professional, there is a wide diversity of players that you are going to be teaching. The more tools that you have in your teaching bag, analogies, tips, technical improvement areas, all the factors that can help a student understand, emulate, and execute what you're trying to teach them, certainly is going to be a useful tool for you. Within this DVD, we're going to be taking you through all the tools and tips and literally all the little nuances of the serve, which you can help your player, your student, develop the serve the way you want them to, without limitations, without letting them stagnate at a level below their ability. So as a teaching pro, pay attention. I think you're going to really enjoy some of the tips, some of the little nuances that we're going to be providing you within this DVD that will really give you a little bit more of an edge, maybe an added tool in your teaching bag to help your students. One of the unique features of this DVD is that we have designed it to be modular in concept. We are looking at 10 of the most common problems relative to the serve, relative to the typical problems that we see among all levels of players. There are little problems between a beginner, there can be problems for the club player, there can be problems that a tournament club player has, and even a more advanced high-level player who's looking to do something more with the serve. You will be able to move directly to each of the modular programs within the DVD that address the particular problem that you might be wanting to look at, analyze, and understand. Within these modules, we also want you to navigate to the first 3 sections within the DVD, which are the foundation building sections. They will determine your understanding, your comprehension of the serve from a foundation standpoint. So make sure you don't miss, make sure you don't skip over these first 3 segments because they really will help you further your understanding and help you understand some of the other issues that we're going to cover later on in the DVD. It is my pleasure to bring you this DVD on the serve from my perspective of 35 years of teaching tennis. Within those 35 years, I've taught 8-year-olds to 80-year-olds. I've trained beginners to world-ranked players. I had one of the winningest high school teams in the country in Southern California. In fact, my father, Bruce Smith, was National Coach of the Year, and between the two of us, we had a team that won over 768 matches and lost 9 times over a 22-year period. That experience of training obviously a large number of players over a long period of time helped me form what I call an advanced foundation, which translates to you in learning how to create a better serve through that experience. I've also written 2 top-selling tennis books, one called Tennis Mastery I released in 2004, and Coaching Mastery in 2008. Both these documents, or both these books, have been fabulous bestsellers, and they also document this experience. But here you have a great tool, a great resource in a true DVD that not only is modular in that you can go from point A to point C, you can go from place to place within the DVD that helps you the most. The DVD is also going to help you continue your path, continue your, what I would call your progression, probably for a lifetime, to reach your highest level, your potential of becoming the best server, and hopefully that also improves your game. Within this first module, we're going to be talking about a key element of the serve, basically the serve speed. This being the first module, this foundation of the speed of the serve has so many factors. We're going to use it as our foundation, use it as our first module. There are many factors, from the grip to the swing path to the stance, all the little factors that contribute to the overall goal, which is to generate racket head speed at the top of our swing. But because it's not just about speed, we're also talking about how the racket interacts with the ball. We're also talking about how the racket strings brush the ball in certain ways. All these factors play a very important role in this first module, the foundation of the serve speed. Within this first module of the DVD, we're going to be addressing one of the biggest problems that players both perceive as well as the problem that a lot of players associate with a good serve, and that is serve speed. Now, we're making this the first module because it is based, the ability of a player to create racket head speed is based on many foundation elements of the serve, from the grip to the stance to the swing path to all the elements of what we call the kinetic chain. The racket head speed is the result of putting elements together in the right sequence, with the right elements within that sequence that will produce a terrific racket head speed, which then will result in obviously not only greater ball speed, velocity-wise, but also spin, the ball coming into the opponent's weakness, and all these other factors are going to be hugely affected by the ability to put all these together. So we're going to be taking apart the serve velocity within this first module and all the elements that contribute to it. When you're talking about any element of the serve, and especially dealing with racket head speed, you've got to start with the most fundamental foundation part of the serve, and that is the grip. The grip is so important for so many reasons, because number one, if I were to learn with a different grip, it changes every other element of the serve. The swing path, my stance, my body rotation, all of those are going to be grip dependent. So the first thing I want to talk about is the grip and how it relates to generating racket head speed. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the grip plays that role, but let's first talk about which grip is ideal. The ideal grip for the serve is a continental. It should be no surprise if you watch every top player, from the pros down to the top college players, their grip of choice is a continental. Now, there are some subtle, and I do emphasize the word subtle, variations within the continental grip that you'll see some players. Most of those variations are not necessarily in the grip, but they are in the wrist position. So you'll see some players turn the wrist in, and you'll see some players turn the wrist out, but it's still using a continental grip. I remember a lot of people would argue Boris Becker used an Eastern forehand grip. Well, he never used an Eastern forehand grip. What he did was he would turn his hand in like this, which mimicked an Eastern forehand grip. All the pros base their foundation, and all top players, top club players, and even top recreational players who have mastered the serve have mastered the continental grip. So let's take a look, first of all, what the continental grip is and how we can find a way to make this grip comfortable and familiar, because let's face it, the Continental grip for most beginners, a lot of club players, and especially a lot of players who learned first with an Eastern forehand grip, have a lot of difficulty with the Continental grip. Within this first module of the DVD, we're going to be addressing one of the biggest problems that players both perceive as well as the problem that a lot of players associate with a good serve, and that is serve speed. Now, we're making this the first module because it is based, the ability of a player to create racket head speed is based on many foundation elements of the serve, from the grip to the stance to the swing path to all the elements of what we call the kinetic chain. The racket head speed is the result of putting elements together in the right sequence, with the right elements within that sequence, that will produce a terrific racket head speed, which then will result in obviously not only greater ball speed, velocity-wise, but also spin, the ball coming into the opponent's weakness, and all these other factors are going to be hugely affected by the ability to put all these together. So we're going to be taking apart the serve velocity within this first module and all the elements that contribute to it. How do you find the Continental grip? A lot of books, a lot of teaching pros use the old standard method of using the knuckles and the bevels of the racket. This is not a bad way to find the grip. As long as you can see where the bevels are and where your knuckles are, you can find most of the grips. The problem I have with the knuckle method is that, number one, a lot of people's knuckles are shaped a little different or slightly different in terms of where they are relative to the fingers and the joints of the fingers. So sometimes people get a little confused. I've got my own way of finding the Continental grip. First of all, let's take a look at what the grip is also called, the hammer grip. Now, if I were to hammer a nail into a wall with the edge of my racket, how would I hold the racket, or how would I hold the hammer to accomplish that? Well, that's the grip that we want to use. That's why the Continental grip is often called the hammer grip. Now, you can checkpoint that and make sure you've got the Continental grip by turning your racket flat and holding your arm straight out in front of you. What you want to look for instead of the knuckles, you want to look at the back of the hand. If the back of the hand, the flat part of your hand, is angled up towards the top of your head and the racket is flat, you have a Continental grip. If I turn the racket or turn my hand so the flat part of my hand is now facing up, I have an Eastern forehand grip. If I turn the grip so that the back of my hand is now pointing directly towards my nose and the racket's still flat, I have an Eastern backhand grip. So again, that flat part of the hand, which is very common and very similar to all people's hands, is a good check of just holding the racket up and making sure that the racket's flat and looking at the flat part of your hand and seeing if that is indeed pointing to the top of your head. You can then go to your hammer position. You can even act like you're going to hammer a nail into the ground and hold it loosely in your fingertips and let the racket sort of fall with the leading edge down. By doing that, you can get a very good grasp of that, literally grasping the racket in the Continental grip, by doing those three elements: a little hammer move, checking the flat part of your hand, and hammering it into the ground, all help a player find and become a little more comfortable with the Continental grip. In talking about the grip, we're talking about the Continental grip, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and how to become more familiar and more comfortable with it. But let's face it, a lot of players hold an Eastern forehand grip for many reasons. And we have countless millions of players who serve with the Eastern forehand grip. Now, in this DVD, we're going to be addressing how a player can take an Eastern forehand grip and still create a lot better serve without what we usually associate a discomfort of changing the grip. Anytime we change a grip within a stroke pattern, especially if we've been playing and executing our competitive game with a certain grip, the grip is the most intimate part of our relationship with the racket. It is the part where most of the fine-tuning muscles of our fingers and hand connect with the racket. Because of that, any grip change becomes very frustrating, very uncomfortable initially. We're going to be talking about ways in which you can change from an Eastern to a Continental and make that transition very comfortable. At the same time, you can create a very good serve with an Eastern forehand grip. The Eastern forehand grip makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, from the sense that if they pick up a rack and they want to hit a ball towards, say, the camera in my situation here, it makes a very logical pattern to swing directly in line with my target. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to a beginner to hold a continental grip with the racket facing directly to my left and try to manipulate that to the target. Well, the grip is just part of the whole serve pattern, and when we change a grip, we're going to adjust other parts of our serve, at least as far as the serve goes, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this DVD. But at the same time, this Eastern forehand grip, it's a strong grip. It puts a lot of hand behind the racket. So the player who picks up the racket, this feels stronger. You see a lot of people volleying with that grip for the same reason. It puts the hand behind the racket. The continental grip puts the hand more on top of the racket. So it gives the perception that it could be a weaker grip until you start to understand all the complexities and all the factors that play into why you can do much more with a continental grip. We're going to be talking about the grip a little bit more in depth. I want to remind you that we're going to be talking a little bit about the Eastern forehand grip and how to create that with a very effective serve. But as we've already mentioned, the continental grip is really the foundation grip for every skilled player reaching the highest level as it applies to the serve. I want to also emphasize that the continental grip is the key grip for the volley and the overhead. So as a player develops the feel and the comfort with the continental grip as it applies to the serve, indirectly they're also improving the opportunity for them to improve their volley and their overhead, as well as the slice backhand and the drop shots are all really based on a foundation that's more towards the continental grip, although those shots can be hit with some subtle variation as well. Now, how do we go about taking what we may have as, say, an Eastern forehand grip and go to a continental grip, and you're picking that up and saying, geez, that just feels so weak and so awkward and so unfamiliar. How can we make that not feel that way? Well, let me first put it in reality terms. If I'm a piano player and I'm learning to play the piano, well, using my little finger, my ring finger, and the other fingers combined is usually very awkward, very unfamiliar. So let's look at it in realistic terms. What would a piano player need to do to train all their fingers? Well, they need to apply certain drills, and we go through those drills, same thing with the person learning to type, to train those fingers to the point where you don't have to think about them anymore. And that's really the bottom line dealing with the continental grip, because when you first transfer over, you're almost having to consciously hold it, think about it, because let's face it, a lot of people who learn with the continental or learn with the Eastern forehand and go to the continental in the middle of their serve, they subconsciously change to their more familiar grip. They don't even know they do it oftentimes. And I've seen this hundreds of times of players who literally start with the continental grip, and as soon as they get to their backswing, they go right back to that, what we call the waiter grip of the racket being flat with an Eastern forehand grip. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But let's get comfort. Let's get comfortable with the continental grip. How can we do that? What are some of the drills and some of the tools that we can use, just like our piano player, just like a person learning to type, that can make this continental grip be absolutely feeling good? Well, the first of these drills that I teach all my players is to make sure they have the continental grip, find their grip. The first drill I have them do is to kneel down and do down bounces. Now, there's variations of this drill that can actually further improve or actually have more effect on gaining the continental grip. But here's the idea. I'm going to kneel down, and I'm going to use my continental grip, and I'm just going to bounce the ball. Now, this pattern, why I'm kneeling down and not standing up, is a lot of times you'll see people try to do this, but if I'm standing up and doing the bounces, my hand naturally wants to go back to an Eastern forehand grip because the angle and the height. By kneeling down, I bring my arm more level and parallel with the racket, and I can do those bounces without losing or being incentivized if I was standing up to do the same thing. Now you can actually take the down bounce drill and expand on that to make it even more prolific in terms of creating the continental grip. Now here's a couple added drills. Find a line. Do your bounces, but now you're trying to hit that line on each shot or each down bounce. Now you might say, well, how is that different than just bouncing it over here where there's no target? Every time I'm not hitting that line, I'm making a subtle adjustment. Every single bounce, I'm making subtle bounce or subtle racket face adjustments so that my racket is controlling the ball. Every one of those subtleties, still using continental grip, further trains my fine muscles within my hand, my wrist, to gain control of the racket head using the continental grip. Okay? Another version of this, or again, another drill using the down bounces, is to do it with your eyes closed. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm going to close my eyes and just try to feel where the ball is. So I'm trying not to look at it. And by doing this, now I'm training not using visual cues, I'm using fine muscle skills to feel where that ball is hitting my racket. It's a great tool. If you've ever talked to a person who is blind, a blind person develops other skills or higher levels of skills to accommodate or to compensate for their lack of sight. So we can take that same concept and close our eyes and feel where that ball is and train our muscles within our hand and connect them to a feeling rather than simply trusting our eyes on every shot. Continuing on drills that will help you gain comfort with the continental grip. I want to emphasize that, first of all, a lot of players have almost a phobia of the continental grip. They just think they can't do it. And I can assure you, I've trained 8-year-olds with a full-size racket to gain a serve with a continental grip, hitting kick serves, flat serves, what have you. And I've had 80-year-olds do it, literally not having any problem because they went through this pattern that I'm showing you. So if you're a player, a beginner using an Eastern forehand grip, and you do these drills, you'll be amazed how quickly you can start becoming familiar with the grip that's going to actually catapult you into serving better down the road. Again, I want to emphasize that we can still serve with the Eastern forehand grip and still have a very good serve. There's no question that we have some players at the club level serving. I'm going to show you some incredible drills with that as well. But let's look at this continental grip in addition to the down bounces that we've just talked about. How can we continue improving our grip? And by the way, these are drills that you can do at home. You don't need to be on a tennis court. You can do them on a patio. You can do them on your driveway, anywhere you have a pretty solid surface. Now the next drill you can even do inside your house. And this is a drill we talk about, I call the catching drill. And there's a couple of variations. I'm going to talk about this. The most basic catching drill, again, check your grip. Make sure you're not cheating over, because if you've been using the Eastern forehand grip, it will be very easy to get that grip to slide a little bit over as you're going through some of these drills. The first catching drill looks like this. I'm going to toss the ball in the air, and I'm going to come down and catch it on my strings. I'm going to throw it in the air and catch it on the strings. Try not to let it bounce. Now, if this is a little bit hard at first, I want to show you a couple progressions. First of all, rather than tossing it in the air, just touch the racket to the top of the ball or the side of the ball. Let go of the ball and cup it at the bottom of your where the ball drops, so about your waist level. Once you kind of get the feel of the ball staying on the strings, then you can practice tossing it and replicating that same movement. Okay? So that is the catching drill on a downward toss. Now you can actually take this to another level and toss it and catch it on the other side of the strings. This would be the backhand side of the strings. But again, it is emphasizing the racket head control relative to the continental grip. Another version or a variation is to catch it on both sides simultaneously or back and forth. And you can toss it higher or just keep it down low if you can get pretty comfortable with it down here in this range. Again, all these movements are very fine muscle skill or muscle control issues. They're fine-tuning the element of the racket. A lot of players, when they do this drill, they make the mistake of trying to get below the ball too soon. And they go like this, and then it bounces off their strings. The idea here is to get the racket moving at the same speed of the ball. And in this pattern, the ball will literally softly touch the strings, and you can literally catch it on the strings. So one thing you don't want to try to do is touch the ball down here, nor do you want to try to touch the ball up here because it'll bounce off to the side. All you want to do is move the racket down with the ball at the same speed that the ball is traveling. I generally try to not think of touching the ball till it is down near my waist. So right here, now, right about there is where I'm actually going to touch the ball, but my racket is moving at the same speed that the ball is falling. So again, both sides of the strings, up and back down, and you'll be able to actually fine-tune that hand to do more. I call it an artistic drill. You think of a painter or even a very skilled person with a sword, the idea of fencing and how they do little jabs and little movements with the tip of their sword. It's sort of the same idea. The idea of being a very skilled fencer would be to not be jerky and have these gross motor skills. It would be to be more fine-tuned and wait for the opportunity to maybe score a point. Well, this drill sort of fits that same sort of analogy in creating the ability to catch a ball very softly and very artistically with the racket. Again, the whole purpose, gain control of the continental grip. A third drill to help gain comfort with the at the same time as gaining comfort with the continental grip, but also starting to deal with swing path and issues related to spin, is a down drill, down bouncing drill, but this time instead of hitting it down and flat, we're going to brush the ball. So we're holding a ball, we're going to brush the side of the ball as we're hitting it. Rather than hitting it flat and down, we're going to be brushing, if I'm right-handed, I'm going to brush the right side of the ball. Now you might look at this and go, wow, that looks familiar. Where have I seen that? Well, if I simply take that same motion and raise it over my head, I now am doing exactly what I would do on a typical slice type of serve, whether a hybrid, anything up here, leading with the edge of my racket. So this down bounce of moving the wrist slightly. Notice I'm not flexing the wrist and going like this, like patty caking the ball. I'm moving the forearm across in almost a hammer-like movement, again using the hammer grip, but moving across the ball rather than straight down. This is a higher level of a drill simply because now we're addressing two direct dimensions. Before we were simply addressing a down dimension, a one-dimensional up and down. The catches were kind of on that same level, but now we're hitting both down and across. Now we're starting to look at what is the elements that contribute to a great serve. They're not just one element, it's not just hitting the ball flat. We're now adding other elements that contribute to the serve. When you start looking at the continental grip, especially from a player who might be shifting from the Eastern forehand grip, it's not just a grip change. We've said that before. The idea of a grip change also means that there's a cause and effect to other parts of the serve. For example, if I'm using an Eastern forehand grip and I'm typically facing the target and serving in this direction, now you can see immediately if I don't change anything but the grip, now I've got a continental grip, and I do everything the same, my serve is going to go, I may miss it completely. And this is a lot of players, they go to a continental grip and they swing, and they're so used to having the racket square to the target because they haven't adjusted anything else, that they're like, wow, I can't even hit the ball with this grip. So what do? They revert back. A player that is dedicated to maybe making the change to the continental grip also has to understand that the ramifications of the grip change are very important to the other elements of the serve. So the first thing I have to understand is now I've got a grip change, I need to change my stance. I'm going to stand more sideways, pointing my shoulder to the target rather than my chest to the target. So that's the first change. Now the other problem, of course, is if people are used to facing the net, as soon as they toss, they may get to this position, and as soon as they toss the ball, they immediately go back to their position before they've hit the ball, so they've really changed nothing. So we have to understand that if I'm going to use a continental grip, everything about the serve becomes almost 90-degree change from or a 45-degree change from my original position to my new position. I want to be sideways as I contact the ball. I don't want to be facing my target. Another element is how the racket interacts with the ball. So if I am swinging with an Eastern forehand grip, typically the butt cap and the forearm elbow tend to lead the way. The racket head delays and hits the ball right about here. Now, one of the telltale signs of a player using an Eastern forehand grip on the serve is they will oftentimes have little marks on their shins. Now the reason for this is because before they make contact, nothing has released between where if I have a continental grip, I get what's called pronation. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the racket moves ahead of the hand within the swing. A player with an Eastern forehand grip will tend to swing down, and the release point actually occurs down by their waist. And the racket head actually, believe it or not, has its greatest racket head speed, not up here where the contact point is, but down here about waist level where the racket tends to release. And they tend to hit themselves in the shin. So you want to understand that now if I'm using a continental grip, I'm no longer leaning down and leading with this part of my hand. I'm now leading with what we call the edge of the racket, the edge on position. We'll talk more about this a little bit later when we talk about swing path. But the real issue is now I'm going to be leading as if I were going to hit the ball with the edge of the racket. At that point, we have what's called pronation come into the serve. And depending on the kind of serve, whether you're hitting a slice, flat, hybrid, or kick serve, that's going to vary. We'll talk about that when we talk about the swing path. If I'm going to use the Eastern forehand grip, I can improve my serve dramatically. And I can actually employ a lot of all the skill factors that we're going to be talking about as they apply to the continental grip. But we're going to actually show you a few tools that you can use to improve your serve as it applies to an Eastern forehand grip. Now, the number one mistake that people make, or the number one contributing fault, is the fact that with the Eastern forehand grip, people tend to hit the ball very linear, straight to the target, which means they're not getting any spin. If they're getting any spin at all, they're usually getting a little bit of backspin, which does not help if we start swinging harder. Traditionally, players with the Eastern forehand grip tend to swing very hard on the first serve and exponentially hit softer on the second because, quite frankly, without spin, I am basically a gravity-reliant player. I have to hit the ball hard enough to clear the net, but soft enough that gravity brings the ball down into the court. So I want to employ some of the features, if you will, of the continental grip. Brushing across the ball, spin in and of itself helps any player control a serve. So rather than swinging directly in line with my target, if I'm going to use the Eastern forehand grip, I want to start trying to apply some element of brush at the top of my swing. Now because of the grip, it does limit compared to what I can do with the continental grip. The Eastern forehand grip locks out. But I can still get quite a bit of release at the top of my swing where I want it to be and get the ball to have the right kind of spin. A lot of the problems that people have with the Eastern forehand grip when they first try to hit with spin is they start to swing and they get under the ball because this feels a little bit more natural or just happens automatically. So what they're doing is they're getting side and underspin on the ball. This ball tends to have a little bit of a lift component, not a drop component. So I want to understand, maybe I should look at it from the axis of spin, and that is if I have a true north-south axis, so the ball is spinning like the earth, I want to try to at least get along the equator of that ball. So even with the Eastern forehand grip, I can hit that equator of that ball with the right angle of the racket, brush it across the ball. If I can move that angle slightly above the equator and get slightly over the ball as I brush, now I'm getting even more of the desirable spin, meaning a ball that will drop more into the court. Now you might ask yourself, well, if I'm hitting with spin, doesn't that slow the ball down? Well, of course it does, because I'm changing the ball velocity to spin. But understand this, if I can get the ball to drop more quickly, I will have the confidence to swing harder. And so by simply hitting with more spin, and the right kind of spin, I can gain a feeling of confidence and knowing I can clear the net by a higher level or a higher margin and still get the ball in. And thus, I'm more freer to swing much harder than I ever would if I were just hitting the ball perfectly flat, or worse yet, with a little underspin, and have to clear the net by an inch if I'm going to swing at 90 miles an hour, 100 mile an hour serve, which doesn't really have almost any chance of going in without some element of spin. With the Eastern forehand grip on the serve, if we're going to make some of these changes where we're going to be brushing the ball at the right angle, and increasing the racket head speed, we want to adjust our stance relative to these changes. So even though I'm keeping the grip the same, I'm going to be swinging from left to right a little bit more than linear, as typically we see players do. So I want to learn how to address the ball with the stance rather than facing the target. So I'm going to use a drill called the fence drill, but I'm going to use it to deal with the stance as much as the swing path. So what you're going to want to do here is, what we're moving away from is facing the target. So if I'm using the fence, I'm going to want to put my left shoulder against the fence. I don't want to face the fence. I want to leave my left shoulder against the fence. As I create the swing path, I'm now using the fence to help trigger my shoulder and my stance to be sideways at the point of contact, versus facing the net or facing my opponent, which typically we see. So stand sideways, hold your Eastern forehand grip, and as you're coming forward, now you're using a little what we call rotational movement. We'll talk about that a little later. But rather than going straight to the target, we're now turning our shoulders slightly to make contact with the ball at the top of our swing. As I'm hitting the fence, I'm adding a slight left to right brush. So I'm adding that motion across the ball, moving across the ball as the strings would do, making impact with the ball. So at this point of contact, I want to train my racket to move across the ball relative to my body's position. Now, what's interesting about this position is it allows me to use the coil element. And we'll talk about this too a little later when we talk about the different ways to increase the speed relative to our legs. But the idea of coil is, if I'm a spring and I want to have some uncoiling power, I need to coil the spring up tighter. I need to wind it up. So if I'm serving and I'm facing the net, I've got nothing wound up. I can't over-rotate because I'd hit the ball way to the left. So now, even with an Eastern forehand, if I've learned, as I've just done on the fence drill, to stand more sideways, now I can turn my hips and get some upper body as well as lower body rotation into the serve and not have loss of control, but yet gain all this added momentum of having my body weight turning into the serve along with the release point of the racket, adding a huge amount of momentum and racket head speed, along with, again, the right kind of spin to get the ball to drop into the court versus staying up high, which typically when we face the net and hit this way, we end up doing. When we're talking about the Eastern grip in the serve, and certainly one of my favorite drills to help players not only learn to get more out of their Eastern grip serve, but a great drill that helps a player transition to the continental grip. It almost encourages the continental grip use. I want to demonstrate this to you because it's such a powerful tool. If I hold an Eastern forehand grip and hold it up near the, choked up near the throat of the racket, now as I swing through, I can use the butt cap or the lower part of the grip as a cue. And then what I mean by this is, as I rotate through and pronate the grip, and as I brush across like I was doing on the fence, the butt cap will come over on the other side of my wrist. If I were to try to swing with the linear path, the butt cap would hit me in the forearm. So this is an absolutely phenomenal drill to get players to understand the feel of both the brush, getting the racket head to move ahead of the hand. This is probably one of the biggest detriments to racket head speed, is if the racket head doesn't pass the hand, then you can only swing as fast as the arm can pull down. I call it the axe serve, where a player with an axe would be hammering a log down by their feet. Well, we don't want to hit an axe serve where our racket head speeds down by our feet. We want it up at the top of our swing. So you almost want to think of the axe being thrown at a log over your head, and this drill with the choked up grip helps that feel of that racket head, or the axe head, if we want to use that analogy, coming through. And having the player learn to feel that. And actually, like I said earlier, if you're an Eastern forehand gripper and you're doing this, you almost naturally start to feel like you want to move over towards the continental grip. So it really helps the transition, but it also helps the overall racket head speed of combining. Now we're talking about the stance, the racket at the top of the swing, and this component of the racket brushing the ball, moving in the right direction across the ball rather than linear, as we've talked about. We now want to start transitioning to what we call a angular momentum serve, which means rather than everything going directly in line with the target, now we're creating this ability to implement our hips, our legs, and our arm all at the right point, which would be the point of contact. Anytime you're working your serve and you're changing or you're adding elements up here at the top of your swing, you're probably going to have some effect on the lower half of your body. We hear commentators and pros alike tell players how important the legs are in the serve, and I don't disagree. But more importantly, the legs can be such a detriment to a serve as opposed to being such a positive. You have to understand, a player in a wheelchair serving correctly with their upper body can generate well over 100 miles an hour. Well, if the top serve with their legs would be 120, then obviously the legs aren't playing that big of a role, but they are playing a role. What I see more often is when players are using their legs, they're using them wrong. And so instead of that contributing 10 or 15%, they're actually a negative. They're not contributing because they're using their feet and their legs wrong. And this builds off the stance that we talked about earlier. So if my feet are more closed or neutral, if you will, not quite like a McEnroe, but certainly a little bit more neutral, as opposed to what we see a lot of players facing the net and serving. Once we get to this position, like the grip, if I was changing from the Eastern to the continental, and I revert back because of comfort, I may have the same thing happen to my legs. In other words, I may still be using Eastern forehand grip, but I'm employing these new patterns that we've just talked about. But at the same time, my feet may just go right back to opening up. And a lot of times we even see players step, and their foot faulting, and they're actually in the wrong position totally before they've made contact. So something has to change up here if we're changing something down here. So one thing you'll want to remember is as you're developing the stance, you'll want to try to maintain your stance. In fact, I wouldn't even try right now to push with the legs. I would try mainly to keep the knees a little bent so that my legs don't falter and come around too soon like they're used to doing. So one thing you'll want to do is with the legs is, first of all, just don't try to move the legs at all. In fact, at every high level serve, we usually see the players push and land and then step with their back foot. At the lower level, we see just the opposite. We see this foot stay down and the back leg come around, which opens up the hips at the contact point too soon. The pros and good skilled players will land, hit, they're still sideways with the hips, the racket's already hit the ball, then the back leg comes around and their weight is moving forward. But if I'm using Eastern forehand grip and I'm trying to employ these new patterns at the top of my swing, I want to make sure I'm sideways down here. I don't want to be opening up like I used to do. So I want to make sure that back toe stays down. Drag that back toe initially. Learn to keep that back leg, let that back leg stay back long enough so that the serve can do what it should do without the hips coming in too soon and actually causing the serve to be, you actually have to decelerate. In other words, if I open up, my body says, uh-oh, I'm going to hit the ball too far to the right if I swing hard, so I have to decelerate and go right back to my linear swing path. So remember, there are certain cause and effect issues here, that if I have everything going correct up here, but I go one part down here wrong, I'm going to have a trouble up here. Now, as we start to develop and improve our serve with the Eastern forehand grip, if we are not making an initial transition to the continental grip and we're working on those patterns, I think you're going to find yourself discovering how much the continental grip contributes to an even better serve. And this is where we want to take you right now and bring you into all the patterns. We've already talked about how to find the grip, how to get comfortable with the grip, but now the serve. How do we implement the continental grip in the serve, especially if we're a beginner or we're a player that's been playing 20 years and we haven't ever changed our serve, or we're a tournament level player and we want to improve our serve even more. And all these factors that I'm going to share with you today, and especially the sequence of learning, is going to help every one of those players I just mentioned. So in dealing with the continental grip, we know we have it, we're comfortable with it. And by the way, I want to also say that if we do the drills that we talked about, the down bounces, the catches, the brushes, and we do them just for a few minutes a day, it is not a difficult transition to learn and become comfortable with the continental grip. It isn't. It won't take long. The problem with most people when they've been using, say, an Eastern forehand grip, and they change the continental grip, they don't do any of those drills, or they do them once, and then they go out on the court and they try to play and try to compete. And when they find that serve's not going in, they're going to go obviously to what's comfortable or what gives them the most confidence, and that's their old Eastern forehand grip. So I want to reiterate the importance of gaining comfort with the continental grip. Now in this next drill is very similar to the drill that we did with the Eastern forehand grip against the fence. It's the same fence drill, but now we're going to do it with the continental. So once we have the continental grip, we're going to take advantage of this fence again. We're going to, again, have our stance very closed as opposed to facing the target. We're assuming we're facing we're hitting towards the fence. Our shoulder, like the other drill, is against the fence, maybe a little bit more closed than with the Eastern forehand grip. Now this continental grip allows for all the factors, all the acceleration, the rotational movements, the angular momentum to be increased than just with the Eastern forehand. So here's where the advantages lie. If I'm serving against this fence, I want to come from back, what we call the collapsed position. Elbow back, not forward. Elbows back. Now the point of contact is released right here. So we're actually hitting a little bit more, rather than hitting flat or across here, we're actually using the tip of our racket to come across our fence. Now the reason I like the fence is because the fence keeps us from swinging forward so much, and especially if that's all we're used to. The fence helps us move across the ball because we can't go through the fence. And this idea of moving across the ball is the key to hitting the right kind of spin and eventually the right power and the right racketed speed at the top of our swing. When you're working with a continental grip and you're new to the grip, I highly recommend you first learn to serve from the service line and not the baseline. And the reason for this is twofold. Number one, if I'm serving from the baseline, there's a sense of need or power necessary for me to get the ball over the net. If the continental grip initially feels a little weak, I'm going to end up reverting back to a stronger feeling grip just because I want to get the ball over the net. The other issue is with the continental grip, because the racket's more open, the ball tends to turn to the left more, and a lot of players do not adjust their stance as we just talked about. They tend to still be a little bit more open because that's how they learned with the Eastern forehand. By coming up to the service line, I don't feel the need to swing hard. Also, because I'm closer to the net, I don't feel like I have to hit under the ball to get the ball over the net as I often do further back. It's almost like a basketball player being able to slam dunk right in front of them because they're so tall, they're so far above the basket. So the other element is, because the ball is going to curve, I don't need to aim, I don't need the ball to travel so far and still get the ball in. It allows a player to see how the ball is going to react. So the player is going to want to just simply brush the ball, again, a little bit of a slice. We'll talk a bit about spin in a minute, but using this pattern of not trying to swing so hard, I can keep my feet down, I can establish my stance, I can keep my body a little bit more closed, allowing the release of the rotational elements to come into play much better than if I were back there on the baseline. In talking about the stance and working with the continental grip and breaking old habits, there's another drill that I use that actually has a lot of value beyond just the stance, but I'll talk a little bit more about some of those other values later. But it's called a one-footed serve. And what the concept is you're just going to serve from one foot. You're not going to stand with both feet. Now, why does this work? Well, number one, if I'm serving with one foot, I have to serve within a sense of balance, because if I serve, my toss goes all over, I'm going to be off balance. The other thing is if I naturally come around with this back leg, by keeping the back leg behind me within this one-footed drill and serving, it trains me to rely on my relaxed power from the rhythm of the serve rather than trying to muscle it with the hips and the shoulders and everything kind of, conflicting sometimes if we don't put them in the right sequence. So it looks like this. So if I, basically, whether I'm going from a collapsed position or a full serve, I want to get comfortable on my right foot. This takes practice, by the way. This is not an easy drill initially. But the beautiful thing about this drill, I've got to be honest, when I've worked with all my high-performance players, and we do this drill with beginners and high-performance players alike, high-performance players serve virtually as fast with one foot as they do with their stance. Here's why. This forces them to be balanced on the serve. They can't overswing. When players overswing, they get the kinetic chain out of whack, and they actually end up not serving as well. So here's a one-footed drill. You just want to try, it looks like the sun's right above my head here, and just serve, and then try to maintain your balance afterwards. So one-footed drill, and then serve, and then land on that back foot. So, and then the back foot comes around to, hopefully, if you can try to just serve with one foot, you can actually train that foot to be there a little bit longer and not have to rely on this back foot. But just, it's a fabulous drill to learn how to swing in a balanced position, and you'll be off balance initially. It also forces you to have a more consistent toss. But obviously, if I'm serving from one foot, I have to swing within a sense of balance. My core is more centered when I serve. Again, in trying to develop greater racket head speed through the use of the continental grip, the stance, the body rotation, the swing path, which we'll talk a little bit more in a minute, there's one more key element that you can, or tool that you can use to help train this element. Remember, the problem with a lot of players is they open up too early, they tend to swing very linear. So we're trying to create a little bit more ability to use coil, okay, or rotational aspects, and we're trying to train a player to be more closed so they have more coil available. If I start too open, I can't uncoil much because then I'm over-rotated. So one of the tools I like to use, I call it the McEnroe stance tool, because basically it's the way John McEnroe served. He was left-handed, of course, I'm right-handed. But he would stand with his back foot almost parallel with the other foot, with his looking over his right shoulder, but my left shoulder, I'm right-handed. And I serve from this position and try to train myself and feel what it's like to go from such a drastic closed stance as opposed to an open stance. I can start to understand how to implement this. And one of the problems, though, with people in this exaggerated closed stance is their toss arm, because when they were here, their toss arm was more in front of them. Now my toss arm is over here. So a lot of players, when they try this drill, they end up tossing it way behind them because their arm is further back. So when you try this drill or this tool, make sure your arms are still out in front of you and not back here where your toss will end up behind you. So exaggerated, and then you can actually curve and uncoil into the serve with a lot more force. And again, helping you understand the continental grip, because that grip is going to make that ball curve a whole lot more to the left, if you're right-handed, than your Eastern forehand grip. We've talked about serve speed in terms of many elements. We've talked about the collapse, the extension, the arm swing, the body rotation, all these, the stance, all these patterns that help contribute or maximize the potential of getting that racket moving the fastest at the point of contact. The lower part of the body, the legs, are also an important part of the serve. Now, I've talked about the fact that obviously if a wheelchair player or a person just standing, I got to tell you a story about Craig Harder, who's a pro that I took lessons from when I was a young boy. Craig Harder had the fastest serve in the world with Roscoe Tanner, 128 miles an hour. This was back in the 70s. Craig Harder had almost no leg movement at all. He was a very tall man. He was about 6'4", but he would simply use this rotational component, literally just to hit a serve about 120 miles an hour, and this was back in the wood racket days, to create his speed. But now we're seeing players like Roddick and virtually all the pros today use their legs. So let's talk about how the legs play a very important part in adding to the percentage of your serve speed. The three areas of the legs that you want to start to look at to increase your serve speed are three directions that the legs can work. Now, the first one is the one most people are probably familiar with, and that's called upward thrust. So if I want to get my body moving up to the ball, obviously giving me even more extension or a higher point of contact, I'm going to need to derive that lift by my legs. Now, some people say servers don't jump. It's a result of them pushing off the ground. Well, I'm sorry, that's jumping. you have to jump to get in the air. But the goal is not to jump for the sake of jumping. The goal is to get your body exploding upward. And so obviously the result of that is leave the ground. But the first key element, you can watch all the pros do this, how much their legs, whether they're talking, we're talking about a platform stance or they come up to the pinpoint stance, we see both stances. But the tremendous amount of leg usage today, especially compared to years ago, how much upward thrust they're getting out of their serve. Every pro today is in the air at contact, a result of this explosive move up to the ball. The second leg usage is called rotational thrust. Now the rotational, we've kind of alluded to this with the stance and the absolute rotation of the hips and the shoulders. But the legs play a very important part in that they're connected to the ground. Now if I'm going to thrust up or I'm going to thrust forward in a rotational movement at the point of contact, that's going to come from the ground as well. So I want to have that coil that we talked about earlier as much as I can. And when you see these pros serve, they're almost all turned with their back to their opponent when they toss the ball, giving them the greatest amount of this rotational thrust to get going at the top of the serve. Again, building that acceleration, building the momentum into the serve. The third level is the hardest level for beginners and intermediate and club players because the name of it's called forward thrust. I'm going to lean forward into the serve. So all these contributing patterns, this up, this rotational, and I'm going to be leaning my front shoulder into the serve, creating an angle of my body at as much as I can. I mean, if you look at most of the pros on contact, if you have them at an angle, you will see this almost a 45-degree angle of their body leaning in, more on the first serve than the second. But here's where a lot of people have difficulty. When they toss the ball more forward to achieve this forward thrust, they, what I call, chase the ball. That is, they open up their shoulders and chase the ball, trying to lean in for it by bending at the waist, versus the optimal thing would be to lean in with their hip and what we call cartwheel. The cartwheel looks like this. They're going to go from a toss position here and cartwheel their shoulders in this pattern, but notice that I'm not rotating yet. The rotation comes right as I come up to the ball to contact and maximize that uncoiling of the spring. In demonstrating this forward thrust, what I want to try to do is achieve a toss that's more forward into the court. I want to cartwheel into the serve and use my body rotation and everything in a forward momentum, which looks like this. And you can actually exaggerate that even more as you gain more comfort. And you can get the body moving in over the top of the... When you're trying to improve the use of your legs, especially with the forward thrust and the rotational thrust, here's a couple quick drills that can help you improve that element in a conscious way. The first one is one we've talked about, would be the one-footed drill. This forces you to push off this front leg versus trying to step with the other leg and rely on it. The whole idea of the serve is that most of the thrust comes from the front leg. You may have a little bit of joint work depending on your stance, But even with a lot of intermediate players, this back leg, when they start to put a lot of weight on it, their serve goes behind them more, and you'll see a lot of players start way back like this, and their toss gets way out of control. They toss it behind them. It doesn't have to be that complicated. The other drill is to measure how far your thrust goes, your forward movement. So you can train, it's almost like an exercise, where you would simply serve, or maybe not serve, but just go through the motion as they'll do here, and push, and see how far you land. So if I landed there, I may say, well, how about if I can go beyond that and push there? So now I'm about a foot further in front of the last one. The one thing you'll want to be careful of is anytime you're working on forward thrust, there is a tendency to step with the front foot, because you're not used to the ball being so far in front, so you go off chasing it with your feet. So make sure you practice bending that. This is where the one-footed drill comes in real nice, is to start practicing pushing and seeing how far into the court you can go, because the further into the court, that means you're tossing the ball more towards the net, into the court, allowing your body to lean to go after that serve, using that forward thrust maximally, trying to get you to get that optimal power into the serve.